I am Andy Dean, and I studied organic horticulture back in 2003, I think, something like that, and sort of fairly quickly fell into just sort of doing people's gardens and built a design and build business and ran that for several years, 15 or more years. And we worked pretty sustainably. We used sort of the organic principles throughout that, really, but I got to a point where I dropped the construction and wanted to focus a little bit more on the design and creating and sort of really focus down on the sustainable bit, because the business was getting bigger and driving me in a slightly different direction. So in doing that, I found that for me and the way I wanted to garden, and having read at the time about extinction crisis, getting really involved in that the horticultural industry wasn't really fit for purpose for what I wanted to do. The soft landscape, the plants bit, was really problematic. So essentially I took a bit of time out, wrote a sort of a way of working for myself to be able to understand it, which turned into an online course. And then since then, really just been trying to understand, research, communicate, work in helping gardens and land managers recover nature, but sort of specific bits I really found that the larval, as we're getting into this, I'm probably jumping ahead of myself, but the larval stage was really needed more attention for me. So let's get into is it just the up and downs? Yeah, okay. So when we're talking about sort of wildlife gardening or on land, and we're looking at supporting insects, this is really what we see a lot of, which is, that's a peacock butterfly on a New England aster, so obviously a sort of introduced species. And I am more interested in this bit, which is the larvae, the caterpillar of that butterfly, and it has very few things to eat. Now, obviously, I'm focusing in a little bit on larvae. I'm not trying not to be adversarial against other things. It's like, it feels like it's a bit sort of one or the other, pollinators or larvae. It's not. But what happens is there is a lot of, I'm running my hand on the pad, that's why. There is a lot of pollinator bias in press and gardening books, and sort of actually wherever you really type information to see how do I garden for insects or wildlife, a lot of that is going to come up. In fact, certainly when I sort of started off on this bit of the journey, maybe sort of 5 years ago, really sustainable gardening or wildlife gardening. I don't want to diss wildlife gardening authors if they've been writing for 20 years about this, and some have. Like, don't get me wrong, but the media talks about don't recycle black pots, put in a bug hotel, bird feeders, nesting boxes, and don't use peat, which is fine, but the nuts and bolts of the sort of basic ecology around these insects isn't really discussed very much. Yeah, so these are all the caterpillars of those 4 butterflies, and we don't really talk about those guys too much. So what is a larva? It's that stage of, when I approached this, I just thought like you had a caterpillar and that was that. Like I didn't know that they went through they started off tiny, they eat and eat and eat and eat, they get a bit bigger, they molt, they do it again 4, 5 times, and that might just be on one plant, it might be on one species of plant, it might be on one family of plant, it might be on a few families of plants, but they're usually pretty specialist. Like they have a pretty narrow feeding and then they go pupate, and then they go into an adult. And that can happen in all different sorts of ways, and I'll show you some life cycle stuff at the end to explain that. Yeah, and approximately 80% of all known insects go through this kind of metamorphosis. And actually, of that 80%, there's really only sort of 4 insect orders that there's a few others, but this is like 99% of the insects that go through this process of egg, larva, pupae, adult. So you've got beetles. We've got about 4,000 beetles in Britain, and about 2,000 of them are herbaceous. And we got about 2,500 moths and 59-ish butterflies, and pretty much all of those, from the really in the minority exception, pretty much all those eat plants. Then you've got the bees, wasps, ants that don't really eat plants, but I put sawflies up there because they're incredibly host specific. So down to 1 plant usually. And then we've got obviously the fly family, which flies actually, they're usually the ones that you don't want. In fact, that whole lot are usually the ones you don't want as a gardener, because they're going to be boring and mining and all that sort of stuff, which I advocate embracing. But if you were a traditional gardener, you might not want to invite those in too much. So what do they feed on? Let's take those 4 that I had right at the start of the presentation, and those their primary food plant, the one they want to eat, they'll be able to eat some more than others, but these guys are really pretty specialist. They only really want to eat nettle. They can eat a couple of other things I'll show you in a minute, but these guys, you'll know the orange tip almost certainly as well. That's cuckoo flower, but also garlic mustard lights, and that's the holly blue, and that, not surprisingly, its primary food plant is holly, but in the spring, and then its other primary food plant is ivy in its summer brood. They can eat a couple of other things. So I'll show you some examples of, I do a bit of work where I swap out, I look at the plants that one might not necessarily want in your garden, but where you could use a secondary food plant like this. So, for instance, peacock and red admiral can really want to eat nettle, but they will eat hop and small nettle. So, but hop's a really great garden plant, right? So if you've got space, it's quite big, but it's a really beautiful plant, and that would work as a substitute. I've stuck these in for gardeners because, I mean, to be honest, actually, the Dames Rocket and the Honesty, both more newly introduced plants, and they don't actually like them so much. There's about another 10 other plants that will eat, but as a secondary food plant, but those would work in your gardens as well. And then holly blue, gorse and bramble would eat as a secondary plant. Now, this is my darling little daughter Dusty, and this is on her first full day in the world, and she had, for probably 6 months or so, an incredibly specialist diet, and we all know what that is. She also needed to protect the environment. She needed to gain weight before she could move on. Not so different to a caterpillar. Slightly less legs, a little bit prettier perhaps. Oh, I don't know, some pretty pretty caterpillars. We're going to see some in a minute from you, Charlie, aren't we? And she's now more of a generalist feeder. There are a few, perhaps like a large yellow underwing is quite generalist, I think, and painted lady is quite generalist, but and actually large yellow underwing is doing quite well at the moment, I think, and probably for that reason. So peacock's coming up a lot, so I'm just keeping a theme through it. The way I sort of have been thinking about sort of pollinator larvae is that pollinator is kind of like, when we garden for pollinators, we're kind of like creating a service station for commuters, if you like. So, or travelling work people that go, they stop in the travel lodge, have a pint of Foster's. Can you still buy Foster's? I don't know. And then move on. I don't really drink. And there's 21 plants listed there. Now, actually, the listed plants, and you can look at, I've actually got I've printed them out actually, but you can go on to UK Butterflies, and they've got an exceptional list of both nectar plants and larval food plants. You can search by plant or butterfly. So, and their list has like 21 plants plus tree sap it will eat. I mean that's just their list. I mean there'll be lots of others that butterfly, that adult butterfly can eat. But this on the other side is kind of a bit like a maternity ward, like that. So we just saw earlier that has like 2, and they're almost certainly not there. If we're in a city garden, they've got to go somewhere else, wherever that might be. And actually, even when they're going somewhere else, between 70 and 75% of the country is farmed. Yes, some of it's going over to regenerative farming, but there's still a lot of intensive farming out there. And our gardens in England represent 4.9% on last time I looked. It's a bit less over Britain, but in England, yeah, it's like 5%. So, I mean, that's a pretty cracking resource, to be honest. Somewhere in the region of 4.5 times the size of national parks that we have, which are incredibly badly managed on the whole for wildlife. Yeah, so, poor little Miss Peacock goes out one day and, she's sort of browsing around the shops and has a chai latte and buys a nice little dress and goes out on an evening and meets a guy, as you do, she's young, and then ends up in trouble. And but where's she going to go? She's like, oh, life's been fun. This is free as the wind. It's amazing. And then she's like, what am I gonna do? And we haven't built the infrastructure for her, right? She's got to go goodness knows where to try and where's the hospital? Where's the maternity ward? Where's the nursery? And not only that, she'll stay until she's an adult. So, where's the primary school? Where's the secondary school? Great bit of this life cycle is that. That's a tiny. Well, it depends on but often that can be a tiny part of the length of the life cycle. So, the plant there that the caterpillar was feeding on also feeds all these guys that are also specialists to that. It's their primary food plant. Yes, they can eat a few others, but they're specialists to it. And many other things are as well, which I didn't put up there, but weevils, incredibly specialist, aphids, psyllids, like sap-sucking true bugs. And then, obviously, take another butterfly moth. I'm concentrating mainly on butterflies and moths here, but take another butterfly and moth, and they've got a whole other set of different requirements. Imagine that at a dinner party. 24,000 insects, roughly 7,000 specialists, 3,000 monophagists, so just want to eat one plant. There's 8 million people on the planet, and you get a dietary requirement, but in our gardens, there's almost everything's got a very specialist dietary requirement. So, native plants. Yeah, I know, all right. I've been a gardener too, I get it. But really, the support for those larvae in that stage that is under-resourced is, for a large part, this. Not always, and I do work to try and find, sort of plants that we normally use in our gardens. So that it's just, so we're not just saying it's only native plants, but look at them. I mean, they're pretty nice as well. We give them a chance. Now, what is a native plant? A native plant is something that survived the last ice age, which was sort of, we say it's the last ice age, whether we're out of it or not is another subject, but about 11,500 years ago, or a plant that got here without human help, which is a bit random, really. And actually, I am using native plants in this a lot, so it's a bit ridiculous for me to say I don't really like the term. But I don't really like the term because I don't find it very useful, because it's very tight. And actually, what I'm interested in more is something like, I don't know if anyone knows Doug Tallamy. If you don't, oh my gosh, look him up and buy his book, especially Bringing Nature Home. He's an American entomologist, incredible guy. He has a oh my God, I shouldn't even start saying because I'm not going to remember what it was. National Home Park, that doesn't sound right. Something like that. A great sort of site where they're building a map all over America of all these incredible things they're doing with native plants. Does a lot of research on it. But he says a plant can only function as a true native while it's interacting with the community that historically helped shape it. When native and alien are defined in terms of the presence or absence of historical evolutionary relationship, the confusion over these concepts disappears. That's quite wordy, but what it's saying, and I've paraphrased that, which is a bit cheeky, but a plant is an alien wherever in the world it might be if it exists without the ecosystem it evolved with. Because what we're talking about is those little spongy, munchy guys want to eat the things that they grew up eating, evolved eating for tens of thousands of years. And who wouldn't? I knew when I knew I would do that. When I was setting this up, I said to Jen, my partner, I'm like, I forgot to do the quiz. I was going to quiz you on how many native plants there are. Anyway, there's about 1,692 native species. That's from Plant Atlas 2020, which is the BSBI, the Botanical Institute of Britain and Ireland, and we have somewhere in the region of sort of 1,700 non-native species in the wild. So we have more non-native species in the wild than we have native species. Now, this obviously isn't talking about the ones in our garden. We have probably, I struggled to find an accurate figure, so I didn't put it in there, but it's in the low thousands of these, what I've got up there, it's called neophytes. The next slide will talk about what a neophyte is, but these neophytes are these sort of garden plants. So like, we've got Berberis, Mahonia, Forsythia, which we would use potentially in place of gorse. In fact, we don't use gorse enough. It's an incredible plant, and we ought to use it more. We'll come back to that, referencing those, because I did a few calculations over them. So an archaeophyte's plant has been here a long time. That came over with the first farmers that came from the Fertile Crescent, reached here about 6,000 years ago, and they had about making, medicinal, and food plants, and probably some plants stuck in their turnips as well that got here sort of on them. And then these guys were brought over some time since Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, something called the Columbian Exchange, where essentially there was a lot of livestock and animal exchange, a lot of plant exchange, a lot of everything. It's kind of almost like the first sort of serious globalization. So, this is the right slide, still in the right meeting. How do we build a house? Well, when we build a house, we stick down the foundations, we bung up the walls, we put a roof on, seal it, put windows in, and then we get the ornaments, we put the wallpaper up, we put the carpets down. Like, we wouldn't dream of buying all those things first and then like finding the house you want or building the house you want. Like, it just doesn't work that way around. And in ecology, I think the same thing applies, that we really, if we looked at our gardens as a sort of resource for nature, then we would lay down those foundations first. Native plants, the habitat, which is really just the, or plants that support. If your plant supports insects, it's almost certainly going to support everything else. Habitat is really just a community of plants, and it's the shape of that. I do another, actually Gemma has asked me to do a talk at the BS3 gardening group in September, so I'm going to talk more about that in sort of some more of the kind of like, I work in a sort of evidence-based way, so I take data and evidence and then I shape that into practices that we can use in the garden. One thing I talk about is looking at your garden like a woodland glade, because that is essentially setting up the right structures for everything to work in, and you get the right sort of mix of plants in that. But if we do those sorts of things and then ornament it, that's great. I mean, I haven't got anything against exotic plants, with a few caveats that we don't, with any plants that we buy, actually, that we're really careful about not blinding with pesticides on, because pesticides do serious damage, that it's better if they're grown in this country because you're not importing pathogens and pests. But yeah, just you've got to be responsible about getting plants, buying plants. Now, because we're in the city, I happen to, I don't know if anyone joined the Butterfly Conservation Moth Recorders meeting just a few weeks ago, but this Dr. Emily Ellis spoke there, and I thought it was really interesting what she was talking about. And because we're in the city, I thought it's just 3 slides of hers that I'm going to share with you, which was a study she did over Leeds, Leicester and Sheffield. And basically, she set up 8 sites over each city in the allotments, sort of spanning from the city centre out and then a kilometre buffer beyond that. And in every case, she was looking at bees, moths and hoverflies, and every case, the numbers decrease the closer to the city centre you got. Now, obviously, there's more impervious area and less greenery, but she was interested in this, so she just took what they were feeding on. So she just took the bees and butterflies, and she took the DNA of the pollen. Well, knowing that bees only use pollen and nectar, only forage pollen and nectar, and then, but the moths wanted more. They wanted habitat as well, so they want to lay eggs and have larvae. And she found that 37% of that resource availability for moths was mainly almost all trees and shrubs. So some of the best plants for larval stages are, things like willow, birch, obviously oak, but actually quite often they'll move around those trees, share those resources. So the 17% that the bees and moths shared, they were wild plants. They were sort of naturally occurring wild plants, or weeds if you like, and these were the ones that she had on her presentation. So I've taken those ones and I've just done a little bit of analysis on them for the recorded insect interactions. This is what I have found. I really like doing this. So I really like taking plants and then I look them up for the recorded interactions that they have, because it can tell us so much about it, and then we can drag insights out of there. And what I do is on the stuff that I produce, I list all of the butterflies, I list all of the moths. I generally just do other species at this point with the other things, and then the pollinators, I list the bees and hoverflies. You can see that the kind of numbers that these wild plants are supporting, quite an incredible amount. In that slide that I did show you earlier, these are the plants that we might use in our gardens, but so let's say we had a hazel sort of early on in the year. What other plants are doing sort of relatively interesting things in the early part of the year? We've got Garrya, Acuba and Photinia, for instance. So I shouldn't have gone to that one. I should have gone to gorse, because obviously next slide was gorse. But so gorse supports somewhere there is 118 insects, 71 phytophagus, 8 butterflies, 16 moths, blah blah blah. Berberis, recorded these are. So we're not saying that, look, some might be under-recorded, but it gives us a hint to what's going on in terms of evolved relationship plants and less evolved. These have only been here, most of them, for sort of, 1, 2, 3, possibly 400 years. Ivy, 206 insects supported. The other guys, not very much. Hazel, 250. That's an incredible amount of insects that these woody plants are supporting, and the herbaceous wild plants that were up there earlier. So, as Gemma, I heard, witnessed this, because it is an obvious question, right? So which 5 plants or which 2 plants are the plants that you would use for wildlife? And it's like, well, it's incredibly nuanced, actually. I can and have produced a list of, the top 50 from the information sources I have, plants that support larval stages. And I'll show you the top 10 in a minute. But actually, what are you trying to support? And even if that's the most likely at this stage, people asking that question are really asking about bees and butterflies. How do I get more bees and butterflies in my garden? And there we are, right back at the start again. So yeah, it's nuanced. There isn't a panacea. Um, but these are the things I sort of tend to try and look at. So understand larval poop plants so we don't dig them all out. So as plants get analysed, we find unlikely candidates. So I do quite a lot of work with a new rewilding organisation called HEAL over in Whittam Friary, Somerset. I used to live in BS3 actually in Totterdown, Oxford Street, until about 4 years ago. Now I live actually sort of basically Longleat Estate really. So I live near there. They've got like a parking area, like it's an old dairy, but 460 acres of old dairy farm, and they've got like a milking sheds, which is their car park, and so they want to make this a bit more, because it's where you arrive. They want to make it, better for engagement. So basically, I'm looking at this area to try and make it more attractive. But actually, what I wanted to do, and what I am doing, we are doing, is working with the naturally occurring plants, is what I call them these days. Weeds, most people would call them. And it's a kind of a ruderal plant, so where disturbed sites, which is where we probably get the worst weeds, because they're the ones that follow everybody, every farmer around or every gardener around, where you're turning over a bit of soil and that plant arrives and you're like, oh God, not that one again. But out of that come insights. So I analysed these. Out of 20 plants, they supported weeds, 1,500, just over 1,500 insect species. And this little guy, who's a crappy little looking plant, like seemingly incredibly insignificant, is a prostrate knotweed. He just creeps around on the floor, doesn't look as though he's doing anything. And that was by far the highest supporter of larger moss, macromoss. So yeah, it supported 89 macromoss. Dock supports something like 59 macromoss, and then you get into like the trees like willows, birches, things like that are in the sort of above the 150s, sort of 150, 60, something like that. Yeah, so I communicate that information. When I try and do one a week. I analyse the plant and I stick that on YouTube and on LinkedIn, usually are the places I use. So you can keep up with those if you want. So gardens and land. So if you've got the plant you have in there tells you a lot. And like there's places where you can go, you can find National Vegetation Classifications, NVCs, and you can say, okay, it's not quite, they're about plant communities, but if you have a naturally occurring plant, you can look at other plants that live in that community. You don't need to go to the garden centre and say, oh, okay, where does it want to be, south facing, everything else like free draining but water retentive, which is the get out from every garden centre, they don't really know. But actually any of these plants will live in the same place. Yeah, you can just build your community of plants with the plants that naturally live with it. And I don't know about the studies here, but I'm sure that there are then symbiotic relationships between those plants and insect species, but that's something I'll be looking a bit more detail in. And then we can also plant for specific insects if we want, because we can usually find their food plants, so we can look at the ones that are in decline. And so I've done this for the butterfly conservation, big butterfly count. They come up with their in decline butterflies every year. Actually, I haven't done this year, but the 2023-2024 one, which I did last year, I'll show you just after this actually, for instance, and nasturtium's a perfectly good garden plant. It's a neophyte, it's a new plant. It supports the large white. I know we don't tend to think of the large white or cabbage white butterfly needs a lot of supporting, but the numbers say it's down 40% on that year, and actually if nothing else, that's going to drag them away from your cabbages, hopefully. And if we're planting those native plants, then, what did we do before all the, 300 years ago when we introduced all these other plants? Like, the pollinators are the native plants. They're the ones that they evolved with, and there are studies out there as well to say that actually insects prefer the plants that they evolved with in pollinating in the nectar as well as, well, we'll get onto a long debate if we're talking about extending the season and stuff, but I'm just like, well, extend the season with native plants. What do we need? There might be some argument for it, but really, there's plenty of native plants out there that will extend the season, and there are plenty of plants that the insects evolved with will adapt to the seasons in a similar way to the insects will. The only caveat I might say is, like, because of climate change, potentially some of these things will actually find a extension of their native range. So, you know, where things are coming south is moving north, then a plant can come with its entourage of insects, and, you know, that's just nature happening in action, right? I've probably gone way over here, I'm sorry, Charlie. Moths are more efficient pollinators at night than bees are during the day. I stuck that one on for you, Charlie. That's a classic, isn't it? Do you know that one? That was Dr. Richard Fox from Butterfly Conservation, and I'm like, what a beauty. It's not a contest, I'm just saying. And that bumblebee on the marsh thistles in my garden. The marsh thistle was found to be the top nectar producer in Britain. It's one of three that, it's sort of a staggering figure that I couldn't quite believe, but marsh thistle, white clover, and heather are apparently responsible for, those three plants, 50% of all nectar resource in Britain. But, like, it just goes to show. So yeah, that's like a thing that I might produce on the butterflies. Those ones are in decline on the right. These ones are on the left are a substitute for, well, some of them are the actual primary food plant, like the older buckthorn, but others are secondary plants that we could equally have in our garden. That would work really well in a garden setting, but you're supporting these guys. And I'm going to do one for the moss as well, Charlie. This has been a bit moth-light, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, slightly. But I am going to. We have got that information on moss as well, so we can do that as well. That's just your top 10 high-value plants from one source. All of those. That was. Yeah, I took the top 50 plants of anything that supported more than 20 larvae. A lot of woody in there. Yeah. Docks support 59 macromoths. Life cycles. This is what I start at the top. These are the four that we had in the first slide, and I just wanted to show the length of that life cycle over a year. Bottom two are in chrysalis, but the next slide, I think, this is the last slide, demonstrates this exceptionally. So. Well, you know, I could rant on this for ages, but we should have a grassland. We should have a British grassland prairie. We don't celebrate it like others have the veldt or pampas or savanna, and we just have this shitty stuff that's left over, and we'll mow it if we don't think of anything better to do with it. But it's amazing. And actually in gardens, all we ever seem to recommend is meadow grasses, which do have their place, but these are your broad-leaved grasses, the ones that, you know, happily grow on their own, need no encouragement, and this primary larval food, cottonwood grass for 7 butterflies, but the life cycle bit is the interesting bit, and this we'll talk about that in the next talk a little bit more, amongst other things, because things like the egg, so all of these stages, the egg stage on the Essex skipper, and then the rest of them are all larval stages. That's a year-long larval stage. So that's where we're talking about how do we support our care rhythms in the garden? So, like, we're doing a lot of damage without knowing it, because actually we've got to change our practices, because if you're not looking at these things and understanding sort of how these insects work, then, you know, we're just cutting that life cycle in half. And I will talk about that more in September if anyone wants to come to that one. Thanks very much. That's me done. Appreciate it. Yeah.